The letter arrived on a Thursday, which Harriet always thought was the cruelest day of the week to receive bad news. She had been in the kitchen of the Aldgate boarding house, helping Mrs. Fenn press the linens, when the solicitor's boy knocked at the back door. He was perhaps 12, red-cheeked from the cold, and he held the envelope out to her without ceremony, as if he were passing a bill for coal. She took it. She read it, standing beside the copper tub, steam rising around her, and she did not make a sound. Her stepbrother Clement had sold Ashvale. Not mortgaged it, not borrowed against it, sold it, the house, the grounds, the tenant farms, the timber rights along the northern ridge, the small lake her mother had loved, the rose garden her grandmother had planted in 1841, all of it in a single transaction, to a man named Gideon Ashcroft, the Duke of Morven, who had apparently wanted an estate in Northumberland and had the money to buy one without blinking. The letter from the solicitor, a Mr. Pemberton she had never met, was brief and unsentimental. He wrote to inform her, as a former resident of the property, that Ashvale Hall had transferred to new ownership as of the 14th of November. Any personal effects remaining in the East Wing had been boxed and were being held at his offices in Newcastle. She was welcome to collect them at her earliest convenience. Former resident. That was what she was now. A former resident of the house where she had been born, where she had learned to walk along the upper corridor, gripping the wainscoting, where her mother had died in the blue room at the end of the hall on a January morning 8 years ago, with the snow coming down outside the window, and Harriet holding her hand and Clement standing in the doorway, looking at his pocket watch. She folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to pressing the linens. It was only later, in the narrow room she rented on the second floor, that she allowed herself to think about what came next. The estate had been left to both of them. That was what her mother's will had said. Harriet had read it herself in this very solicitor's office 2 weeks after the funeral. Ashvale was to be held jointly until Harriet married or turned 30, at which point her half would pass entirely to her. Until then, Clement managed the property and drew the income, but he could not sell it without her signature. He had forged her signature. She was nearly certain of it. She had signed nothing. She had been in London for 11 months, working first as a governess, and then, after a disagreement with her employer about appropriate duties, at the boarding house. She had written to Clement 3 times in the past year. He had not replied to any of them. She lay on her narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Clement, who was 4 years older than her, and had always resented the fact that their mother had loved Harriet more openly, and who had told her at the funeral that she ought to find a husband quickly because he had no intention of keeping a sister indefinitely. She thought about Ashvale, the smell of the place in summer, pine and rain, and something faintly mineral from the lake, the way the light came through the long windows in the library at 4 in the afternoon and turned everything amber. She thought about the rose garden. Then she stopped thinking about it and started thinking about what she was going to do. It took her 3 weeks to make the arrangements. She sold the small cameo brooch her mother had left her, the only piece of jewelry she still owned, and used the money for the coach fare north. She wrote to a woman she had known slightly in her previous life, a housekeeper named Mrs. Dunnett, who had left service at a neighboring estate some years ago and now ran a small registry office in Newcastle. She asked, carefully, whether there might be any positions available in the Ashvale district. She did not mention that she had grown up there. Mrs. Dunnett wrote back within the week. As it happened, Ashvale Hall had recently changed hands, and the new owner was rebuilding the household staff almost entirely. The previous housekeeper had retired. 2 housemaids had left with her. The new Duke, or rather his man of business, had sent word to several registries that they were looking for a cook's assistant, and a second housemaid immediately, with further positions to follow in the new year. A cook's assistant. Harriet, who had never cooked anything in her life beyond the occasional piece of toast, thought about this for a long time. Then she wrote back and said she had experience in both positions and could present references on request. She arrived in Morpeth on a gray Tuesday in December, having spent the last 2 hours of the coach journey rehearsing the name she had decided to give. Not her own surname. Cowell was too recognizable in this county. Her mother's family had been known here for 3 generations. She would use her mother's maiden name instead, Harriet Vane. Harriet Vane, who had worked in 2 London households and was looking for a position in the country. The man who met her at the coaching inn was not the Duke. He was a compact, efficient-looking man of about 50, named Mr. Greystone, who introduced himself as the estate steward and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who was badly understaffed and choosing not to be too particular. He asked her 2 questions about her experience in London, accepted her answers without pushing further, and told her she would start in the kitchen under Mrs. Pallant, the new cook, who had come up from Northampton. Harriet said thank you, and followed him into the carriage, and when the iron gates of Ashvale came into view through the bare November trees, she kept her face entirely still and looked at her hands. The house was smaller than she remembered, or perhaps she was simply larger. The east wing, where she had slept as a child, looked the same from the outside. The same gray stone, the same 3 chimneys, the same ivy that her mother had always meant to have cut back and never did. Someone had cleared the front drive. The rose bushes were still there, cut back for winter and looking like small fists. Mrs. Pallant was a large, composed woman with iron-gray hair and the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She looked Harriet over, asked whether she had a strong back and a willingness to be up before 5 in the morning, and when Harriet said yes to both, she was shown to the kitchen wing and given a uniform that was slightly too long in the sleeves. The other housemaid, already in residence, was a girl of about 17 named Polly, who had grown up in Hexham and was deeply intimidated by the size of the house. She told Harriet all of this within the first hour, along with the information that the Duke had not yet arrived. He was still in Edinburgh settling some business, and that the upper floors of the house were currently being repainted, which meant the smell of turpentine was everywhere. "Have you seen him?" Harriet asked, keeping her voice neutral. "Not yet," Polly said. "But Mr. Greystone says he's very particular. Likes things done properly." She lowered her voice. "They say he bought the estate off the last owner for less than half what it was worth. That the last owner needed money quick, and the Duke knew it and didn't offer a penny more." Harriet looked at the fire in the kitchen grate, which was very large and very old, and which she knew, because she had known this kitchen since she was 6 years old, drew slightly to the left and needed a particular adjustment to the damper in winter. "Did they?" she said. "Is something wrong?" "No," Harriet said. "Nothing at all." She spent the first week learning the rhythms of the house as it was now, which were different from the rhythms as she had known them. The upper library had been refurnished. She caught a glimpse through the open door, when she was carrying fresh linen upstairs, and felt something shift painfully in her chest at the sight of the new furniture, the wrong furniture, arranged in a room she knew by heart. The blue room at the end of the hall, her mother's room, was being used as a storage space. Several of the tenant farmers had already come to meet with Mr. Greystone, and she recognized 2 of them, old Mr. Hadley from the northern farm and his son, and had to find reasons to be elsewhere each time they were in the house. She also, quietly and systematically, began to go through the estate papers. This was easier than it might have been. Mr. Greystone kept the accounts in the estate office off the main corridor, and the office was not always locked. She was not looking for anything in particular, Or rather, she was looking for one thing in particular: any document that bore her name, any correspondence related to the sale that might tell her what Clement had done and how he had done it. She found nothing in the first week. She found nothing in the second. On the 16th day, the Duke arrived. She heard the carriage from the kitchen, where she was helping Mrs. Pallant with the evening meal. A proper dinner now, because he was expected. Not informal arrangements they'd been making for Mr. Greystone and the workmen. She heard the wheels on the gravel, and then voices in the entrance hall, and then footsteps that were heavier and more deliberate than Mr. Greystone's quick step. She did not go to look. She continued paring the turnips and did not look up. He came into the kitchen an hour later, which was unexpected. In Harriet's experience, dukes did not generally come into kitchens. Mrs. Pallant stiffened visibly and said, "Your Grace," and Polly nearly dropped a pot. He was perhaps 35, darker than the portrait Harriet had found in the upstairs storeroom. She had looked, when she found the portrait of the previous owners, the family of the man who had sold the estate to Clement's father, and had understood she was looking at history laid over history. The Duke of Morven was not like any of the men she had known in this county. The hunting men, the farming men, the men who had called on her mother in the years after her father died. He was quieter than that. He stood in the doorway of her kitchen and looked at the room with careful attention, as if he were cataloging it. "Mrs. Pallant," he said, "I wanted to tell you directly. Dinner this evening is for 3. My solicitor has arrived as well." He paused. "The kitchen looks well. Thank you." Then his attention moved, and Harriet realized he was looking at her. She kept her eyes on the turnips. She was aware of being looked at in a way that had nothing particular in it, nothing unkind. It was simply the look of a man accounting for the people in a room, but her hands were not entirely steady. "You're new," he said, "not a question." "Yes, Your Grace," she said. Harriet Vane. A pause. "You've worked in households before?" "Yes, Your Grace," he said. Nothing else. He thanked Mrs. Pallant again and left, and the kitchen exhaled. That night, after the dinner had been served and the dishes brought back and washed, and the kitchen put to rights, Harriet sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the servants' wing and thought about what she had seen. He had looked at her kitchen, though she had no right to call it that now, and said it looked well. He had said thank you to a cook. Small things. She tried not to let them mean anything. She tried harder when she remembered what Polly had said, that he had bought the estate for less than half its value, because Clement had needed money quickly, and the Duke had not offered a penny more. Whatever Clement had done, whoever had forged her name on those documents, the Duke of Morven had profited from it. Perhaps he had known. Perhaps he had not asked. Either way, Ashvale was his, and she was a servant in it, and the solicitor's papers she needed were somewhere in this house, and she intended to find them. The difficulty was that she was also starting to find reasons, small and inconvenient ones, to revise her understanding of who Gideon Ashcroft was. He was not what she had constructed in her mind on the coach journey north. She had built him, in those hours, into something easy to hate, a calculating man who had taken advantage of her brother's desperation, without caring what else he was taking. She had not imagined someone who thanked his cook, or walked his own grounds at 7 in the morning, or sat in the estate office with the door open, going through Mr. Greystone's accounts with a frown of what looked genuinely like concern for the numbers. She had not imagined that he would notice, on the 4th morning, that she was the one who had adjusted the kitchen damper correctly, and would stop in the corridor and say, "The fire draws better. What did you do differently?" She had told him about the adjustment. He had listened properly, the way people who are actually curious listened, and then he had thanked her and walked on. She stood in the corridor for a moment afterward, feeling confused and slightly wrong-footed, which was not what she had planned to feel. She found the papers on the 19th day. They were not in the estate office. They were in a locked drawer of the desk in the library, the room she had watched being refurnished, with its wrong chairs and its new curtains the color of dark water. She had not planned to search there. She had been sent to dust, and had noticed, in the way that someone notices a thing they have known since childhood, that the second drawer on the left had a different lock than it should have, a newer lock, added recently. She came back that night, with a pin she had taken from Mrs. Pallant's sewing basket, and spent 20 minutes on the lock. At the inside was a folder of correspondence. At the top was a letter from Clement. She recognized his handwriting before Biff read a word of it. The same loose, impatient script she had known since childhood. She read it in the dark, by the light of the single candle she had brought, and by the time she reached the end her hands were shaking. Clement had not forged her signature. She had been wrong about that. What he had done was worse in a different way. He had found a clause in their mother's will, one she had not known about, one she suspected her mother had not entirely understood the implications of either, a clause that allowed the surviving male heir to sell the estate outright if the female heir could be shown to be, in the precise language of the document, incapable of managing her own affairs. The clause was meant for genuine incapacity. Clement had told his solicitor that Harriet was ill, mentally ill. He had implied, using language careful enough to be legally arguable. And on the basis of that representation, and with the support of a doctor whose name she did not recognize, he had pushed the sale through. He had not forged her name. He had simply removed her. She sat on the floor of the library for a long time. The candle burned. Outside, the wind was doing something complicated with the trees, the same thing it always did in December, a sound she had known her whole life. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor. She blew out the candle. She pressed herself against the side of the desk. The footsteps paused outside the library door. The door opened. He stood in the doorway for a moment, a lamp in his hand, looking into the darkness of the room. Then he saw her. She stood up. There was no point in doing anything else. They looked at each other across the width of the room. "The drawer is open," he said after a moment. "Yes," she said. "You've been going through my correspondence." "Your correspondence." She heard the edge in her own voice and could not quite remove it. "Yes, I suppose it is yours now." He was quiet for a moment. He came into the room, set the lamp on the table, and looked at her with that careful attention she had noticed before, the attention of a man who was actually trying to understand something. "Who are you?" he said. "Not what are you doing here, not you're dismissed. Who are you?" She was very tired. She had been tired for weeks, really, and before that she had been tired for months, tired of the boarding house and the narrow room and the life she had been slowly building out of nothing, and before that she had been tired of watching Ashvale from a distance and receiving no replies to her letters. The tiredness went all the way down. "My name is Harriet Cowell," she said. "My mother was Anne Cowell, who owned this estate before my stepbrother sold it. She put the folder of correspondence on the desk between them. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not reach for it. "Sit down," he said finally. "I'd rather stand, Harriet." He said her name quietly, without emphasis. "Sit down. I'm going to read that, and then we're going to talk, and it's going to take some time. There's a chair behind you." She sat down. He read slowly. She watched his face while he did it. He was not easy to read, that was clear, but she could see, in the slight changes around his eyes and the set of his jaw, that he was not pleased by what the letters said. Not the mild displeasure of someone encountering an inconvenience. Something more concentrated than that. When he finished, he set the folder down. "The solicitor in Newcastle's he, Ed. Pemberton. I've never met him. I know you haven't. I corresponded with him during the purchase. He represented your brother." He paused. He represented your brother exclusively. I dealt with another solicitor on my side of the transaction. He was looking at the folder again. I was told the estate was unencumbered, that there were no other claims. My brother told his solicitor I was ill, Harriet said, not in those words. Enough to satisfy a sympathetic reading of the will. Are you ill? No. He looked at her directly. No, you're not. He leaned back slightly in the chair. I bought this estate in good faith, Miss Cowell. I want you to understand that. I do understand it, she said. And she found, to her surprise, that she did. She had spent weeks wanting someone to be simply, cleanly guilty, and here was the evidence that the thing was more complicated than that, which was almost worse. That doesn't change what was done. No, he said. It doesn't. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, Your brother needed money quickly. Do you know why? She shook her head. Gambling debts. Substantial ones. I know this not because I was told it, but because I made inquiries afterward when something about the speed of the transaction bothered me. I should have made those inquiries before. A pause. That is a failure on my part. Harriet looked at him. In all the conversations she had rehearsed on the coach journey north, in all the versions of this confrontation she had imagined, she had not imagined this particular version. The Duke of Morven sitting across from her in the library that used to be her library, telling her that he had failed in his diligence and owning it plainly, without softening. What will you do? She asked. That rather depends on what you want to do, he said. She had thought about this too. She had thought about the law, which was uncertain, and about what Clement had done, which, while not clearly illegal, only deeply wrong, and about what she could prove, and what proving it would cost, and what she would be left with even if she won. I want Ashvale back, she said. That is what I want. I know it may not be possible. Not in its entirety, he said. Not quickly. The legal position is, he stopped. I have a solicitor I trust, not Pemberton, someone else. I would like to put him onto your brother's conduct and see what he makes of it. He looked at the folder again. The clause in your mother's will is the central issue. Whether it was fraudulently invoked is a question for someone who knows this area of law better than I do. Why would you do that? Harriet asked. It came out more plainly than she intended. You own this estate. If my claim is valid, it affects you directly. He looked at her for a long moment. Because I know what it is, he said, to have something taken from you through someone else's dishonesty, and to have no one who is in a position to help choose to do so. He did not elaborate on this. She had the sense, strongly, that he was not going to. And because I am sitting in your library, he added, and you came back to it even though you had nothing, and you have been in my kitchen for 3 weeks, and you adjusted my damper. There was something in his voice when he said the last part, a very small, carefully controlled thing, that was almost humor. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Mrs. Pallant has been wondering why it draws better. She thinks it's the coal. He said nothing, but the line of his mouth shifted very slightly. Outside, the December wind was doing its thing with the trees. The lamp on the table was steady. No draft in here. She had always liked that about this room. It was one of the things she missed. And the fire in the grate, a real fire, a good one, was burning the way a fire in that grate had always burned when someone knew what they were doing with it. There is another matter, the Duke said, and his voice had changed back into its careful register. Your presence here. As a member of my household. I'll leave, Harriet said immediately. I understand that this is. I didn't say that. He looked at her steadily. What I said was that there is another matter. What I mean is that if you leave, you are in London in a boarding house, and I am here with the papers and the solicitor and the question of your brother's conduct, and you have no ability to know what is being done on your behalf or to have any say in it. A pause. What I am proposing is that you stay, not in the kitchen. My housekeeper position is still unfilled. Mrs. Dunnett's registry has been unable to find anyone suitable. Harriet stared at him. "You're offering me a position in my own house," she said. "I'm offering you a position in a house in which you have an unresolved legal interest," he said, "which allows you to remain on the property, to have access to the relevant documents, and to be present for whatever my solicitor determines. It also means you are not sleeping in a London boarding house on whatever you were paid there, which I suspect was not enough." She looked at the desk, the lamp, the fire. She looked at the folder of letters. "I have one question," she said. "Ask it. The price you paid for this estate, you said yourself it was below value. Clement needed money quickly, and you knew it. You paid what you paid because you knew he couldn't wait." She looked at him directly. "Is that accurate?" He held her gaze. "Yes," he said, "that is accurate." She nodded. She had expected denial or justification or a longer answer. The single yes was almost harder to manage than those things would have been. It was honest, and honesty from someone you were trying to keep in a simple category was always inconvenient. "All right," she said. She took the position. The winter went slowly. Mr. Adair, the Duke's solicitor in Edinburgh, a dry, careful man who communicated mostly by letter and said nothing he did not mean, wrote 3 times in January alone. The news was neither swift nor simple. Clement's invocation of the will clause, it turned out, rested on the testimony of a doctor named Holt, who had never actually examined Harriet and had signed a statement on the basis of Clement's description of her behavior in the months after their mother's death, which had been, by any reasonable measure, grief, and not what Holt had characterized it as in his statement. Mr. Adair thought this was the thread worth pulling. So did the Duke. Harriet learned in those weeks that the Duke of Morven had a habit of appearing in rooms she was managing and asking questions that were not about the household. He asked about her mother. He asked about the estate as it had been, the tenants, the farms, what had been managed well, and what had been let go under Clement's years of inattention. He listened the way he read, slowly and with full attention, and he remembered everything she said. She also learned, gradually, against her intentions, that he had lost something too, though he did not say so in those terms. He had a house in Edinburgh that had been his father's, and a younger sister who had married badly, and something that had happened several years ago involving a man named Caldwell, who had been his closest friend, and had cost him considerably, in ways that were financial and also not financial. He did not tell her any of this in a single conversation. It came out in pieces, over weeks, in the way that things come out when 2 people are in the same house in winter and eating dinner together because the alternative is eating alone, and finding, gradually, that the conversation has become something they look forward to. In February, Mr. Adair's letter arrived with the news that Dr. Holt had agreed, under some pressure, to recant his statement. Harriet read the letter twice in the estate office. Then she sat very still for a moment. Then she went to find the Duke, who was in the library. The library that was becoming, slowly, a room she could be in again, partly because of the new chairs, which she had decided she actually liked, and partly because of what happened in it in December. And she knocked on the open door, and he looked up from his papers, and she said, "Holt has recanted." He set down his pen. She watched something happen in his face. Not quite a smile, but something that the possibility of a smile was made of, some underlying configuration that was quiet and pleased and warm. "Sit down," he said. "I'm not in distress this time," she said. "I can stand perfectly well. I know. Sit down anyway." She sat down. Outside, for the first time in weeks, there was weak sun on the snow, and it came through the long windows and did something to the light in the room. Turned it amber, or something close to it. Something she had known since childhood and had thought, in November, she might never see again. "What comes next?" she asked. Adair files a formal challenge to the sale on the basis of Holt's fraudulent testimony, he said. The process will take several months. The outcome is not certain, but Adair thinks it's strong. He paused. In the meanwhile, you are here and the estate is being managed as well as I've seen it managed in the 18 months I've been involved with it. Harriet looked at her hands. That's not a coincidence. No, he said. It is not. She looked up at him. He was watching her with that careful attention, the attention she had first seen in her kitchen on the evening he arrived. And she understood now that it was simply how he looked at things he was trying to understand. And that she had moved, somewhere in the winter months, from being a thing he was trying to understand into being a thing he understood. At least in some ways. At least. Partly. And the distinction mattered to her more than she could entirely account for. Gideon, she said. It was the first time she had used his name. She had not planned it. He went very still. If Adair's challenge succeeds, she said carefully, and the sale is voided, or partially voided, or whatever form the outcome takes, I don't know what the legal position of the house would be, whether you would have any remaining claim, whether I would, whether we would be in opposition. Yes, he said. Those are the right questions. I'm asking you whether you've thought about them. I have thought about very little else for the past 6 weeks, he said. And I find I keep arriving at the same answer, which is that whatever Adair's challenge produces, I have no interest in Ashvale as a property separate from your connection to it. He held her gaze. None whatsoever. The fire in the grate was doing what it did in this room, burning steadily, no draft. Outside the window, the snow was going soft in the weak February sun. The tenant farms along the northern ridge, she could not see them from here. But she knew they were there. She had known they were there, since she was old enough to understand maps, were waiting for spring the way they always waited for spring, with the particular patience of things that had been there a long time and intended to go on. Harriet looked at the man across the desk from her, who had come into her kitchen in December, and thanked her cook and asked her about a damper, and who had sat across from her in this room with a folder of evidence of his own mistake and said yes when she asked him whether it was true, and who had listened to her for months with his full attention. She thought about what it meant to trust someone, not the simple trust of strangers, the baseline assumption of good faith. She had learned, at some cost, what happened when that was misplaced. Something harder and more particular. The kind that was built, over the course of a winter, out of small specific things, a fire that drew properly, a letter read in full, an honest answer when a dishonest one would have been easier. Neither do I, she said. For what it's worth. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, It's worth quite a lot. The February light came through the windows and lay across the library floor, and Harriet Cowell sat in a chair that wasn't hers yet, and might yet be, in a house she had grown up in and come back to through the back door with a borrowed name, and thought that there were worse places to start from than here.